the presidential election before the United States Supreme Court.
Oyez, oyez, oyez. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Sitting in tonight, Charles Gibson.
Good evening. That call to order you just heard reverberates through the Supreme Court every day that the justices convene. But today was no everyday session. Never before has the United States Supreme Court taken up a case that could decide a presidential election. It did today. That session of the Supreme Court and two defeats for Al Gore in Florida courts dominate the news today, and we start with the U.S. Supreme Court. Specifically at issue before the court was an appeal from the campaign of George W. Bush that the Florida Supreme Court had exceeded its authority when it ruled Florida counties could have more time to hand count ballots. Throughout an hour and a half of argument, the justices were aggressive in peppering lawyers with questions, and they seemed centered on two issues. Was there a federal issue involved that would even require the U.S. Supreme Court to rule? And if so, did the Florida Supreme Court improperly rewrite Florida law, as Governor Bush contends? A sure sign of the historic nature of today's proceeding, for the first time ever, the court immediately released an audio tape of the arguments. But in the courtroom, listening in person, was ABC's Jackie Judd. Jackie?
Charlie, even now, hours after the hearing ended, there are still some Bush and Gore protesters here at the Supreme Court. As boisterous as the protesters were, nothing intruded on the ritual inside.
The Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
The courtroom was packed. Al Gore's top campaign aides, his children, Republican senators and congressmen, they were all there.
God save the United States and this honorable court.
First up, Ted Olson, lawyer for George W. Bush, laying out the campaign's main claim.
The Florida Supreme Court overturned and materially rewrote portions of the carefully formulated set of laws enacted by Florida's legislature.
Olson made it through only 56 seconds of his arguments before a justice broke in.
Well, Mr. Olson.
Sandra Day O'Connor, often the court's swing vote, demanded to know why the court even had a role in this case.
And so you probably have to persuade us there's some issue of federal law here. Otherwise, why are we acting?
Olson argued that a century-old federal statute prevents laws governing an election from being created after the fact, which he claimed is just what the Florida court did, and also that the U.S. Constitution gives state legislatures, not the courts, the right to choose electors.
The framers of the Constitution debated long and hard. It was one of the longest debates that took place during the formation of the Constitution. Where should this power be lodged?
Of all the justices, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who seemed most sympathetic to the Florida Supreme Court.
In case after case, we have said we owe the highest respect to what the state says, state Supreme Court says, is the state's law.
Midway through the hearing, Chief Justice Rehnquist seemed to scold his colleagues for being too talkative when he made an unusual offer to the lawyer representing Florida's Attorney General.
I'm going to extend your time 2 minutes, Mr. Hancock, because you haven't had a chance to say a lot yet.
Well, I don't need the extension of time, Your Honor.
And so it went on. Lawrence Tribe, Gore's attorney, said the state court did nothing illegal. It simply provided a way for a close election to be examined.
It would be rather like looking more closely at the film of a photo finish. It's nothing extraordinary.
Justice O'Connor again, but this time suggesting the state court had overstepped its authority and perhaps there was a federal case here.
Here is the certification date. How could it have been clearer?
Justice Scalia also pressed Tribe. He said the state court relied on the Florida Constitution to draft its decision, excluding state lawmakers, and that violated the U.S. Constitution.
I read the Florida court's opinion as quite clearly saying, having determined what the legislative intent was, we find that our state constitution trumps that legislative intent. I don't think there's any other way to read it. And that is a real problem.
It was Justice Breyer who asked the most straightforward question of all. What happens if the court rules in favor of Bush?
Is there a consequence that flows from that is real, adverse, significant?
The answer from the Secretary of State's lawyer was Bush wins, the litigation in Florida ends. Not everyone agrees. They say that no matter which way the court rules, it will not provide nearly so much finality to this presidential election. Charlie?
Jackie Judd at the Supreme Court. Our thanks. Also inside the Supreme Court for arguments today, ABC legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, no mistake there that Jackie was using mainly questions from the justices, because that's the most important, right?
Charlie, we already knew what the lawyers think. Today was the day we listened to what the justices had to say.
All right, so how do you read those questions?
Well, clearly, several justices, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Souter, Justice Stevens, were concerned about the issue of trampling on the rights of Florida. The Florida Supreme Court issued this ruling. It was about Florida law. Why don't we just stay out of it? That was a message from them. Another issue of interest of the Chief Justice in particular was, elections go from the voters to the state electors to the United States Congress, which counts the Electoral College. He seemed to think that perhaps the Supreme Court had nothing to do with this. Again, thinking maybe we should stay out of this whole controversy.
Well, so is that where you think, and I realize this is very dangerous stuff, but is the court pointing toward staying out of this, or perhaps ruling on the merits here?
I think one thing we have to keep in mind about the Supreme Court in really big cases, like Brown v. Board of Education about school desegregation, about United States against Nixon, about producing the White House tapes, the court always struggles to be unanimous in decisions like that. And if you looked at today's argument with unanimity possibly in mind, it did seem that a narrow ruling in favor of the Gore position, staying out of it, seemed the most likely, but we've been surprised on this story many times.
Yeah, there is nothing predictable about any aspect of this. Jeffrey Toobin at the Supreme Court, thanks. So we want to assess the legal and political impact of what the Supreme Court might do. So we turn to election law expert, Florida State law professor, and ABC consultant Stephen Guy, and also our ABC political analyst, George Stephanopoulos. And I'm going to ask you both the same questions, but one from a legal and one from a political point of view. And Stephen, let me start with you. What would happen if the court just decided to take a pass on this and not rule on this case?
Well, if the court does nothing, then obviously nothing changes, and on the ground here, essentially the litigation simply goes forward.
So that would mean Florida would be the whole ball game.
That's right. Then Florida would be the whole ball game. Likewise, if Gore wins, same thing. The litigation here goes forward. Essentially nothing changes. Bush's margin of victory is just above 500 votes, and Gore still has to prove that he has 500 votes out there from these various counties to overcome that margin.
Okay, and when I say Florida is the whole ballgame, I mean the Florida courts, the cases that are going on there, because obviously who wins Florida determines who wins the presidency. But then what happens if they rule for George Bush and say that the Florida Supreme Court overstepped its bounds when it allowed more time for hand recounts?
Well, the immediate impact of a Bush victory would be that the margin of victory for Bush would go from just above 500 votes to just above 900 votes, because all the ballots that were hand counted between November 14th and November 26th would now be excluded from the count. But the Gore contest litigation would continue to go forward. The same legal standard would apply in those cases. And I guess you could even argue that the Gore case actually becomes slightly stronger, because he could argue that there were actually no hand counts whatsoever included in the margin of victory so far.
So that means that the Florida Supreme Court, or what's going on in the Florida courts, not just the Supreme Court, but all the Florida courts, basically more important than what the U.S. Supreme Court might decide?
I think that's right. I think this is where the action is, frankly. The Florida courts have sort of superseded the U.S. Supreme Court in some ways.
All right. Thanks very much, Stephen Guy. Let's take the political questions then to George Stephanopoulos.
Well, I agree with basically what Stephen said about the legal situation, but if this court goes for Governor Bush, that's a near fatal blow to Al Gore politically. Remember, before the court decided to take this case, many Democrats were murmuring maybe it's time for Gore to concede. They held off. If you have a headline, Supreme Court backs Bush, you're going to see Gore's political support start to collapse in the Congress.
And what if the Supreme Court stays out of it? Is there any political effect?
Well, it buys Gore time to get these votes, but he still has three big hurdles. Can he actually get the votes counted before the mid-December deadline? Will the Florida courts both include those votes for him, and will he have enough to go ahead of Governor Bush? And then finally, even if he gets a certification from the Supreme Court, then we'll probably be in a situation with 2 slates of electors before the Congress. Can he get a win in a Republican House? Hard.
So the bar is still very, very high for the Vice President.
Many hurdles for Gore. But remember, Seminole County, a single decision by a judge can swing thousands of votes.
All right. That's a story also that we're following.
Sure
George
is.
Stephanopoulos, thank you very much. All right. That's the situation with the Supreme Court. And there was so much attention on the Supreme Court arguments in Washington that events in Florida got sort of overshadowed, but they moved forward as well today, and they were significant. Al Gore suffered 2 defeats. George W. Bush won 2 big victories in rulings by the Florida Supreme Court. And a Florida District Court got ready for arguments tomorrow on Al Gore's attempts to get more votes counted. Details on all of those cases from ABC's Aaron Brown, who's in Tallahassee. Aaron?
Charlie, the Supreme Court cases first. In the first of them, the Palm Beach County butterfly ballot case, the court decided that however confusing those ballots may have been, they weren't confusing enough to require what they call judicial remedy. That means no revote, no throwing out the votes. It is as it is. In the other case, the Gore team had asked the Supreme Court to order a recount of 13,000 disputed ballots to begin now. Before the trial determines whether that count would count, the court said no. The Gore side wanted it to speed things along, something the Bush side does not want. The 600,000 ballots, more than 2 tons worth, that were loaded up and sent by truck from Miami to Tallahassee today, may not be the last load. The Bush legal team wants 1 million more.
The Gore tactic of selectively using only their strongest precincts violates every essential element of fairness.
The Bush side's blueprint for the case is breathtaking in its scope. From the highly technical, they claim the case was filed too late, and that since voters were technically choosing electors, not the candidate, Gore, the candidate, has no right to contest the outcome. Then there is the highly controversial. One county, Broward, the Bush lawyers claim, used an illegal standard to determine what a vote is, and that other counties wrongly rejected overseas military ballots. And above all, they argue that if the judge orders any ballots recounted, he must order every ballot, 6 million of them, hand-counted as well. While the Gore team wants just 2 witnesses, the Bush side proposes more than 90, a wish list that could be cut to 20 if necessary. They range from the famous Bob Dole and New Jersey Governor Christie Whitman, who were recount observers, to dozens of canvassing board officials, statisticians, a Texas judge, a punch card machine expert, and a canvassing board assistant identified only as Deborah, last name unknown.
They've raised 29 defenses, they've proposed 95 witnesses, and a pile of exhibits that would stack up to the sky. Just anything to block and delay.
So it all begins, this extraordinary, historic moment in Judge Sanders Saul's courtroom at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Charlie?
All right, Aaron Brown, thanks. We take a break. When we come back, theater and high emotions outside the Supreme Court. And one of the observers inside the courtroom, Ted Koppel, watches the drama there.
Their excitement at being a part of this piece of history was almost as inspiring as what went on inside the court itself.